1 till 2. Okay? Hopefully most of you can meet that. I know some of you will have a few clashes, but it was the only lecture slot we could get that will house the year group. And I didn't want to do it next week because we've got other assessments. So we're going to do it on Thursday. So that will be the missing, the last end of the lecture that I am conscious is ill to deliver. Also, your last practical quiz closes at 9 o'clock tonight for Group C, and so tomorrow morning we'll release the results of the second post-practical quiz for the whole year. Okay? Okay, so we're going to move on this morning. Looking at the structure of the glomerular capsule, looking at the process of ultrafiltration within the glomerulus, and looking at some of the Starling's forces that govern ultrafiltration. Now, it's very important that you guys know about Starling because he works and studied here at UCL. So, as someone that's studying physiology at UCL, if you don't know about Starling, then succinctly about Starling's forces that he described, then we would be letting you go. So it's interesting and nice to know about Starling and his forces. And finally, we'll round that off with looking at glomerular filtration rate and the clearance of inulin. Now, lots of people first look at that and go, oh, Dr. Houston can't spell. That really should say insulin. It should not. It is inulin. And inulin is a plant sugar that we use in kidney physiology. So, we're focusing still on the very first part of the nephron. We're still focusing on glomerulus and the glomerulus capsule, but we will cover the other elements within the other lectures within this series that will end the term in kidney physiology. So the first stage of what we think is kind of true kidney function, the filtration process, happens within the glomerulus because we've got to be able to filter that blood that's coming in through the afferent arteriole through the glomerulus, and we want a proportion of that to be filtered every time the blood passes through the kidney. So we have a range of selective filtration barriers that exist within the glomerulus capsule, and we know that the fluid that gathers within the glomerulus capsule space contains little or no protein, but a similar composition to plasma. And I'll show you the evidence for that in a few minutes. So remembering that we've got the afferent arteriole coming in, the knot work of the glomerulus and the central cells in between that hold it all together, and then the efferent arteriole. And that we can change the inflow and outflow purely by altering these smooth muscle cells that surround the afferent and efferent arteriole, both through the juxtaglomerular cells and through the macular denser cells, which are part of the distal tubule that folds back and comes close to the glomerulus again. So the process that we call ultrafiltration within the kidney is actually made up of 3 processes. The first is the ultrafiltration process, the filtering of our red blood cells to keep them in the blood away from the filtrate that's being generated. And then from the filtrate that's generated, we want to reabsorb anything that's valuable in there. Obvious thing is things like glucose, amino acids, and also further secretion, moving things that the filtration barrier didn't remove and are still in the efferent arterioles that pass out of the glomerulus. Then that blood flow still flows around the rest of the tubule of the kidney, and we want to actively secrete other elements from that blood flow into tubular fluid. And tubular fluid will go on to be urine eventually. Now we know that the kidneys receive this really high blood flow, 1/5 or so of the resting cardiac output, and about 1/5 of that is forced through the capillary walls due to straightforward hydrostatic pressure, your blood pressure. So this is the first ultrafiltration step. And then what happens? Well, we've got a selection of plasma components which have to be then processed within the nephron structure. and the fluid passes along the tubules because its composition will be modified, because if not, it would be a very wasteful process. We would lose a lot of nutrients, a lot of valuable energy, and also water along the tubule process. So in terms of the filtration process as it occurs, then we want to not lose proteins. So the main aspect of the filtration barrier within the glomerulus is to keep that filtrate protein-free. And when proteins do start to show up in the urine, it's a sign that there is something wrong with the kidney barrier, that we're starting to see some forms of renal disease as the barrier is not working effectively. So the barrier itself is a barrier not only of size but also of charge. So the barrier restricts the movement of molecules that are greater than 3.6 nanometers in diameter. So smaller molecules we talk about being freely filtered, i.e. they go through the barrier slots and pores and go straight into the filtrate. So there's nothing that's selectively held back about elements that are described as being freely filtered. The one way that we can keep smaller molecules in the blood plasma is their charge. We know that cations are more readily filtered than anions, and we know that factors such as serum albumin, one of our main carrier proteins in the blood, has a radius that will allow it to be freely filtered. But because it carries a negative charge, there's a negative charge on the filtration barrier as well. Negatively charged particles are repelled from the barrier and therefore held in the blood, so that they're not lost into the filtration fluid. So, other elements, water, other ions, small molecules such as glucose are all described to be freely filtered because they will go straight into the tubular fluid at the same concentration as they are present in the blood. When we look closely at the filtration barrier, we see that within the kidney it has a fenestrated endothelium. Now we've got fenestrated endothelium in a number of key areas within our body. For me, as an endocrinologist, I think of them being present in the brain as a way of filtering all those lovely neuropeptides down into the periphery into the body. But in the kidney, again, we use it as a filtering process where the endothelium lining the capillaries have holes in them. They purposely have holes in them. So it is really a meshwork that is there to filter. It has specific fenestration, specific pores within the endothelium to promote this filtration. So any time that the pressure of the blood flowing into the kidney, into the glomerulus, it's going to push that fluid out through those gaps, out through those fenestrated pores. The next layer is a basement membrane. So a loose arrangement of connective tissue. And again, this produces another filtration barrier. And outside that are the podocytes. So when we look, the blood will flow down in through the capillaries. It will go through the pores in the endothelium, through the basal lamina, and then through slits between the elongated processes that come out of the podocyte. When you look at scanning EM, this is a podocyte here, and it sends all these front-like projections which overlap to produce slits, which is the final filtration barrier. So in terms of barrier, again, this is a nice detailed picture. So the blood will be coming in this direction. It will go through the individual pores that exist in the endothelium, go through the basement membrane, and then through the slits between the pedicels and the filtration slits in the podocytes, and then end up in the Bowman's capsule space. So it's designed that the fenestrations here will keep the red blood cells in large proteins. Then we've got the basement lamina, and then filtration barrier that exists within the Bowman's capsule. Now, Byrne and Richards were credited in 1929 with identifying what the filtration barrier in the kidney was able to perform. Up till then, we didn't know that the filtrate that was generated was protein-free. It wasn't clear how the filtration barrier worked. And they were able to carry out micropuncture, so fine glass needle puncture, into individual nephrons. And you go, well, how do you prove you were in the right place? Well, simply, they took a sample and then they inject a small amount of dye after the micropipette is released. And then you section the organ afterwards. So again, this was done in animal models, because it's not ethical to do it with humans, and different biopsies. And you could see where the micropipettes had been, where they were sampling from. So, sampling from the Bowman's capsule, it was easy to find out that basically this was the same composition, the tubular fluid was the same composition as plasma, just missing the protein element. So, in terms of the terminology, when we look at the filtration within the kidney, we're looking at the glomerular filtration rate. And the rate is the functionality of both kidneys taken together. We can look at single nephrons, but it's much more common to simply talk about the glomerular filtration rate, so the sum total of the action of both the kidneys. Now, the substances that are small, low molecular weight, they tend to be freely filtered, so water, urea, glucose, sucrose, other sugars such as inulin, myoglobin, etc. Whereas larger molecules such as our hemoglobin, the serum albumin, gets kept in the capillaries, it doesn't get freely filtered. And for albumin, that's not just its size, it's mostly to do with its charge. So therefore, we don't lose our valuable plasma proteins such as albumin. The barrier is designed not to allow those through. So what governs the glomerular filtration rate? Well, the key pressures within the body were described by Starling. And the key process is driven by a range of hydrodynamic forces, but the key one is hydrostatic pressure, the pressure of our blood moving around the body. And that pressure drives blood, or the plasma, to leave the capillaries under hydrostatic pressure. Now, because of the filtration barrier, the proteins remain in the blood, and this causes a different pressure. This produces an osmotic pressure, more clearly defined as the plasma protein oncotic pressure. They all mean the same thing. They're an osmotic pressure driven by the protein that's left in the plasma not being present in tubular fluid, because that pressure will then drag fluid back from the Bowman's capsule back into the capillaries, where it can balance between the protein components. So the oncotic pressure goes in the other direction to the hydrostatic pressure. We also have some oncotic pressure, so mostly this oncotic pressure opposes the hydrostatic force. But there's small oncotic pressures, or small amounts of pressure within the Bowman's capsule. And so when we look at all these forces together, we talk about the net filtration pressure. So let's have a look at that in a bit more graphical detail. So within the Bowman's capsule, we've got the blood flow coming in through the afferent arteriole, and the pressure, or the hydrostatic pressure coming in is about 55 millimetres of mercury. We also have this hydrostatic pressure purely from the capsule. Again, as fluid would flow into a space, if there's fluid already there, then it will have a back pressure on the filtration process. So because the Bowman's capsule space, as it's described, is not usually a space, there's usually fluid in there, there is some hydrostatic pressure that will push the fluid back in the other direction. Also pushing in that direction is this oncotic static or osmotic pressure, pushing fluid back towards the capillary because of the osmotic pressure of the proteins that get left in the glomerulus. So when you add these two together, or more precisely subtract the other pressures from the hydrostatic pressure, we end up with a mean of around 10 millimetres of mercury, driving the overall filtration in the way that we want to generate tubular fluid. So this is pertinent just to the kidney. If we look at how the Starling's forces affect filtration elsewhere in the body, then if this was a positive pressure driving fluid out of our capillaries all the time, we'd all have swollen ankles, swollen wrists, we'd have edema, we would have fluid build-up in the interstitial areas around our body. So normally in our systemic capillaries, there is no net overall flow between the capillaries and the interstitial fluid. So normally these forces are balanced, that there's as much pressure moving fluid into the interstitial compartment as there is oncotic pressure pushing fluid back into our capillaries. So we always have a fluid flow across our capillaries throughout the body. But overall, they tend to be balanced very carefully. Now, that's not the case in the kidney. We actually want to drive that filtration process to make the kidneys work. So, within the kidney, we have this higher hydrostatic pressure and the structure of the filtration barrier to drive that fluid movement, because we want it to purposely generate tubular fluid. So the main difference in the kidney is that we've got this elevated capillary hydrostatic pressure, which will drive the change. And here we do have protein changes that will drive the pressure back, but not sufficient to even out the Starling's forces. So within the glomerulus, the capillary hydrostatic pressure is always high, and if it balances with the oncotic pressure, then we will get no filtration occurring. So as I said before, the values are that it's around 55 millimetres of mercury driving the filtration, and the movement back is much smaller, and the change in oncotic pressure, the protein driving pressure, again is lower. There is a small amount of oncotic pressure generated within the Bowman's capsule. In some equations you will find it will be ignored because it is very small. Here I've included it for completeness, but it is very small. So when you calculate the glomerular filtration rate, we have to take all the forces into account. So the main driving force is the hydrostatic pressure coming from the capillaries, driving fluid out of the capillaries into the Bowman's capsule space. Small amount pushing back, and then the oncotic pressure is taken into account with a filtration coefficient. But again, the net filtration pressure comes out as a positive around about 10 millimetres of mercury. So, using those Starling's forces, when elements do change their pressure within the kidney, remember I talked last time about auto-regulation, so mostly the kidney can regulate its own pressure and keep it as regular as possible over the normal range of changes in blood pressure that we experience, so that the glomerular filtration rate does not change because the blood flow in and out of the kidney is tightly regulated and kept at a constant. But on the rare occasions where these pressures do change, we see if we increase the hydrostatic pressure, we would see changes that would increase glomerular filtration rate. So people with high blood pressure can then change their kidney function, and it can, over long periods of time, lead to some forms of kidney damage. If the blood pressure drops, then the glomerular filtration rate drops. So someone that has low blood pressure, that often feels faint when they stand up from a sitting or lying position, will have a reduced glomerular filtration rate and therefore may have build-up of various waste products. hydrostatic pressure within the glomerulus capsule. Again, this will decrease glomerular filtration rate because it will be a back pressure against the main driving force and reduce glomerular filtration rate. And this can happen when you've got kidney stones, there's a retention of urine in the bladder, which then just backs up the system and adds to an increased back pressure to the normal driving force. We can also see changes in plasma protein. So where the oncotic pressure in the capillary falls, so this can happen in liver failure, you're not producing as much albumin and other plasma proteins, it will actually increase glomerular filtration rate and can be used as a sign of liver failure. Whereas if the oncotic pressure increases, then it will reduce glomerular filtration rate, and this can be seen as a measure of renal failure as disease progresses. So we can change these pressures. We usually adapt it through water regulation, but in severe hemorrhage, prolonged exercise, we can see alterations in glomerular filtration rate. So, how can we measure glomerular filtration rate? Well, we can't measure it directly, but we do have good ways to estimate glomerular filtration rate. So, if you wanted to measure the filtration rate, we need to look for something that's freely filtered, because we want to see it coming through into the tubular fluid and finally into urine. We want something that's not reabsorbed or secreted, that the kidney function isn't going to alter how it's handled. And we want it to have no influence on renal function, such as blood flow. So it's not so easy to find elements that match those criteria. But inulin is. And inulin is a plant polysaccharide, so it's a plant sugar, so it's not naturally occurring in the human body. You have to infuse it in as a steady state into an individual. And it fulfills all of these elements. So it's like glucose, it's freely filtered, but here, because it's not endogenous, it's not absorbed, it's not secreted, and it doesn't affect blood flow. So inulin is our gold standard for measuring glomerular filtration rate. And when we use inulin, we can look at the rate of its excretion. So we would look at the concentration that shows up in the urine and multiply that by the amount of urine that's produced to see the amount that's released. But the rate of excretion is also dependent on the plasma concentration. So remember, we'll look at if something saturates all the transporters, then it will affect the concentration and the rate that it's cleared at. So to look at the clearance of something such as inulin, we will express this as the urinary concentration multiplied by the amount of urine that's produced per minute and divide that by the plasma concentration to get a rate of excretion, a rate of clearance usually in mils per minute. So when we define renal clearance, it's the volume of plasma that's completely cleared of a given substance in 1 minute. Now, the clearance of a substance can be used to determine a number of different renal functions. And it is the overall measure. Remember, we were talking about glomerular filtration rate being the net product of both kidneys. So it's the amount or the rate at which the blood can be cleared of a substance by both the kidneys. Now, when we calculate the clearance of inulin, it estimates that glomerular filtration rate is around about 120 to 130 mils per minute in a normal adult human. So that's over 180 litres of plasma that are filtered per day. So your kidneys are pretty efficient and they're running at full speed all of the time. So we can use the estimate of glomerular filtration rate that inulin gives us to work out what's going on overall in the kidney with other factors that the kidney is clearing from its system, from the blood system. So if we look at a substance and calculate its clearance, again taking urinary concentration, the amount of urine that's formed, and dividing that by the plasma concentration, we can work out the clearance of any substance. So it can be a drug, it can be another molecule in the body. Because the amount that goes into the kidney is the amount that comes out either in blood or in urine. So if the amount of substance that is cleared is less than the molar filtration rate that we can estimate with inulin, then the amount that's filtered, we know, has to balance with the amount that's excreted. So if a substance is reabsorbed, then we know that the clearance would be less than the molar filtration rate. Okay. If the substance is cleared better than the molar filtration rate, then we know the substance is secreted. So if there's more of it showing up in the urine than you expect to show up with the glomerular filtration rate that's been estimated from inulin, then we know it's been secreted, there's been more of it added. So reabsorbed substances should be cleared better, it should have a clearance that's less than the glomerular filtration rate, because you've lost elements that were in tubular fluid and they've been reabsorbed into the blood supply. Now the typical example of that is glucose. So all of the glucose that is filtered, it's freely filtered because it's a small molecule, should not show up in the urine because the kidneys are designed to reabsorb all of your glucose. So we know that the clearance of glucose should be 0. So it's less than the glomerular filtration rate because it's all been reabsorbed. It's all usually reabsorbed pretty much in the toxin convoluted tubule. So if the glomerular filtration rate or the clearance of something is very low, then it has been reabsorbed. If the glomerular filtration rate is higher, the clearance is higher than the standard glomerular filtration rate for inulin, then the element has been secreted. So waste products, toxins, drug breakdown products, they would be actively secreted. So there's more clearance than there would be from an estimate of glomerular filtration rate. So we do expect you to be able to carry out a clearance calculation. So have a look at the slides again and have a look at the textbook. There's model values given to you and you can work through a worked example as well. So when we look at estimates of the glomerular filtration rate, then great, we've got an estimate and we can say whether something is secreted or reabsorbed as a net effect. Usually both things are occurring. There's a bit of reabsorption, there's a bit of secretion, but what you're looking at is the net outflow. Because you're measuring the concentration in urine, it's the overall net effect. Now, unfortunately, inulin is not very convenient to carry out when you go, oh, I want to work out someone's glomerular filtration rate. You've got to bring them into hospital, you've got to cook them up, put in an infusion, wait for that to be a steady state, and then measure glomerular filtration rate. So it's the gold standard, but it's not very convenient to carry out. So alternatively, we can use our backup, which fits most of the criteria, and it's already present in plasma, and that's creatinine. Now there are small amounts of creatinine that are secreted into the proximal tubule, so it's not ideal, but again it gives us a very close estimate to inulin and it's much easier to perform. So ideally we would use inulin, much more routinely we use creatinine. So when we look at the glomerular filtration rate, it's the amount that both kidneys form per minute. And the balance of our glomerular filtration rate is important because if glomerular filtration rate is too high, then the blood will flow past very quickly and everything may not be reabsorbed because of the pressure driving everything through the nephron structure. If it's too low, then we will get everything reabsorbed, but some of the waste products may not be adequately excreted. Therefore, that's why the kidney has that auto-regulation to try and keep glomerular filtration rates balanced. And the glomerular filtration rates are directly related to the net filtration pressure. So often the key things that change are the hydrostatic pressures from the blood coming in to the glomerulus in the first place. When we look at the importance of glomerular filtration rate, then in someone that has glomerular filtration rate over 90 mils per minute is sitting in the normal rate. So I said, for a normal human, we would expect it to be 120, 130, but down to about 90 mils per minute is perfectly normal. Again, you can bring the glomerular filtration rate up by just keeping blood pressure under control. But as glomerular filtration rate drops, we see it in subsets of pathophysiology. So as renal function is reduced and there's lots of other urine abnormalities, then it causes the drop in glomerular filtration rate. Again, glomerular filtration rate can be used to see ongoing renal disease, to get to the point that if the kidney function is so low, then you have to go for end-stage renal failure, and therefore people will need peritoneal dialysis to allow them to function as well as possible, with the view that kidney transplantation may be required to reintroduce absolute kidney function. But most of the causes of renal disease come from poor blood flow, so it usually happens prior to the kidney. We do get renal diseases that cause loss of nephrons and therefore nephronic structure, and you can get blockages within the kidneys as well, so blockages of the ureter, lower tract, stones, etc., building of deposits that will block fluid flow through the kidney. So, overall, the nephron regulates the internal processes via ultrafiltration, reabsorption and secretion. Now, I know I've not had a lot of content in today, but just understanding the glomerular filtration rate and how it changes and Starling's forces are actually a large part of renal physiology. And if you can get to grips with those, kidney physiology is straightforward. So the barriers there to maintain our protein content within the capillaries, and the different layers are not only a size but also a charge barrier. And the net filtration is the key driving force in net filtration is the hydrostatic pressure coming from the blood pressure, and this will drive the glomerular filtration rates. And we can test that and estimate the glomerular filtration rate, allowing us to measure the clearance in the kidney of particular drugs, metabolites, etc. And we do this by either gold standard using inulin, plant sugar, or by using creatinine to estimate the glomerular filtration. Okay, thank you very much for your